Champagne glasses clinked like tiny bells across the dining room, but all I heard was my father's voice slicing through the celebration. "We're so proud of her lucky break," he announced, grinning wide for the cameras. 20 faces turned toward me, smiling, applauding. My hand trembled against the stem of my glass. Lucky break. The same man who'd called my career ambitions too big for a girl like you now stood bathing in the glow of my achievements as if he'd built them himself. I forced my lips into something resembling a smile, but inside, something ancient and patient began to crack. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the financial audit sitting on my desk would soon reveal whose luck had really run out. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs a paper trail. Welcome to Revenge with Precious, where we share real stories of betrayal, resilience, and the courage to stand up for yourself. These are tales of people who refused to stay silent, who drew boundaries when love turned toxic, and who chose their peace over family obligation. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, these stories are for you. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that might change how you see your own life. Please, watch till the end. Compliments of the season. Let's get started. The restaurant glowed amber under Edison bulbs, casting soft shadows across white tablecloths. My father stood at the head of the table, shoulders back, commanding the room the way he'd commanded every space I'd ever known him in. His hand wrapped around a champagne flute, catching light as he raised it higher. Around us, aunts and uncles, cousins I barely recognized, all leaned forward waiting. This was his stage. It always had been. "To my daughter Mara," he began, voice rich with manufactured warmth. "We always knew she had potential, even when she doubted herself." Laughter rippled through the crowd, gentle and approving. My jaw tightened. I'd never doubted myself. He had. "Sometimes luck finds the right people," he continued, tilting his glass toward me. "And we couldn't be prouder." The word hung in the air like smoke. Luck. Cameras flashed. Someone called out, "Speech, Mara." But I couldn't move. My fingers pressed white against the glass stem, knuckles sharp under skin. This wasn't pride. This was theft, dressed in a toast. He patted my shoulder for a photograph, leaning close enough that I could smell his cologne, expensive and suffocating. "Guess some of my discipline rubbed off on you, huh?" he murmured. The room erupted in applause. I sat frozen, surrounded by celebration, feeling like I was drowning in shallow water. My name is Mara Delgado, and for most of my life, I believed my father when he said I wasn't enough. That belief didn't come all at once. It accumulated slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a river, layered and heavy. When I was 8, I told him I wanted to be an architect. He laughed and said, "Sweetheart, let's be realistic." When I was 15 and showed him my acceptance letter to a summer math program, he glanced at it and said, "That's nice, but don't let it go to your head." By the time I was 22 and holding my college acceptance letter, funded entirely by scholarships I'd fought for alone, he'd already stopped pretending to care. "You'll come crawling back," he'd said flatly, signing nothing, offering nothing. I never did. Instead, I moved to Portland, worked 3 jobs, graduated with honors in financial analysis, and built a career in corporate auditing that he once told me was too ambitious for someone like you. For years, I sent updates to my mother's old email address, hoping she'd somehow see them from wherever she was now. She died when I was 19 quietly, the way she'd lived. At her funeral, my father gave a eulogy full of words like devoted and supportive, never once mentioning that she'd worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat while he chased business ideas that never quite landed. I didn't correct him then. I was too young, too grief-stricken, too conditioned to stay silent. The years between leaving home and that dinner were a blur of proving myself to people who had nothing to do with him. I worked for Creston Financial Group, one of the top auditing firms in the Pacific Northwest. My job was to find discrepancies, to follow numbers until they confessed their secrets. I was good at it. Better than good. Last April, I'd uncovered a $7 million embezzlement scheme buried in a tech startup's payroll records. The case made headlines. My name appeared in business journals. I received a promotion and a corner office with windows that overlooked the river. That's when my father called. It had been 3 years since we'd spoken. His voice on the phone was casual, almost friendly. "Mara, it's your dad. Heard you're doing well. Really well." I didn't respond immediately. Silence stretched between us like a test. I was thinking, he continued, maybe you could take a look at some numbers for my company. Just a professional favor. You know how these things work. I should have said no. But there was something in his tone, something that reminded me of my mother's voice years ago, whispering late at night when she thought I was asleep. I set something aside for you, Mija. Something no one can touch. I'd never found out what she meant. She died 2 months later. I'll think about it, I told him, and hung up. I visited his office on a Tuesday in late September. The building was smaller than I'd expected, tucked between a coffee roaster and a vintage furniture shop in southeast Portland. The glass door had his name etched across it in bold serif font, Delgado Capital Ventures. Inside, the air smelled like leather and ambition. A receptionist greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You must be Mara. He's been talking about you all week. She led me down a narrow hallway lined with framed articles, photos of my father shaking hands with people I didn't recognize, awards with his name stamped in gold. At the end of the hall, his office door stood open. He sat behind a wide oak desk, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing broadly as he spoke. When he saw me, his face lit up. I'll call you back, he said into the phone, then stood, arms open. There she is. My daughter, the financial genius. I didn't move toward him. He dropped his arms, laughed awkwardly, and gestured to a chair. Sit, sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? I'm fine, I said, keeping my voice even. You wanted me to look at something. He slid a folder across the desk, thick with documents. Just a routine review. Nothing complicated. I figured who better to trust than family, right? I opened the folder. Inside were balance sheets, transaction logs, expense reports. Standard corporate records. But something about the way he watched me, eyes too focused, smile too fixed, made my skin prickle. I'll take these home, I said. Give me a week. That night, I spread the documents across my dining table, each page a puzzle piece waiting to fit. At first glance, everything looked normal. Revenue streams, operating costs, investor contributions. But I'd been doing this work long enough to know that normalcy was often a disguise. I started with the basics, cross-referencing dates and amounts, checking for inconsistencies. Hours passed. My coffee went cold. Outside, the city hummed with distant traffic and the occasional siren. Then I found it. A series of transactions dated back to 2006, the year after my mother died. Small deposits at first, then larger sums, all labeled Trust Reinvestment, with a reference number I didn't recognize. I pulled up my laptop and ran the reference through several databases. Nothing. Then I tried a different approach. I searched my mother's name, Elena Marquez Delgado. The screen flickered, then loaded. 3 results. The first was her obituary. The second was a wedding announcement from 1989. The third was a legal document filed with the county, irrevocable trust established for Mara Elena Delgado, minor beneficiary. My hands stopped moving. I read the line again. Minor beneficiary. Me. The document listed my mother as the grantor, my name as the sole beneficiary, and a trustee I didn't recognize. The trust had been established when I was 10 years old, funded by my mother's inheritance from her own parents, who'd passed away that same year. I'd never known. My father had never mentioned it. I scrolled down to the transaction history. The account had been drained. Every dollar. Gone. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I printed every page, highlighted every discrepancy, and built a timeline. The trust had held $340,000 in 2005. By 2007, it was empty. The withdrawals were labeled Business Capital Investment, and signed by my father. He'd been listed as co-trustee, a detail that made my stomach turn. Co-trustee meant access. It also meant responsibility. Legal responsibility. The money had been funneled directly into Delgado Capital Ventures, the company he now ran, the company he bragged about at every family gathering. The same company he just asked me to audit. I thought about my mother's whisper. Something no one can touch. She tried to protect me, tried to build something I could stand on when the world felt unsteady. And he'd taken it. Not just taken it. He'd erased it, disguised it, and built his reputation on top of it. The next morning, I called my supervisor at Creston Financial, a woman named Delancey Frost who had the kind of sharp mind that could see through corporate fiction. "I need advice," I said. "Personal situation. Potential conflict of interest." She listened as I explained, her silence heavy and thoughtful. When I finished, she said, "Document everything. Don't confront him yet. If this is what you think it is, he'll panic and destroy evidence. Let the process work." "What process?" I asked. "Creston's been selected to audit a list of mid-sized investment firms in the Portland area. Random selection. Your father's company is on that list." I felt my breath catch. "When?" "Next month. And Mara, you won't be assigned to the case. But you'll be consulted. Officially." The next family dinner happened 3 weeks later, this time at my father's house, a renovated Craftsman in Laurelhurst with a manicured lawn and a view of the hills. I hadn't planned on going, but something pulled me there. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the need to see him up close, knowing what I knew. The dining room was full again, the same faces, the same laughter. My father moved through the crowd like a conductor, orchestrating conversation, ensuring everyone felt his presence. At one point, he raised his glass again. "I want to thank everyone for being here," he said. "And I especially want to acknowledge Mara, who's been kind enough to help me with some business matters. Everything she knows, she learned from me." The room clapped. I didn't. My eyes drifted to the wall behind him, where a photograph of my mother hung in a simple wooden frame. She looked young, maybe 30, her hair pulled back, her smile soft and genuine. I wondered if she'd known what he was. If she'd stayed because she hoped he'd change, or because she didn't know how to leave. I looked away before anyone could see the expression on my face. After dinner, my father pulled me aside in the hallway, his hand on my elbow, voice low. "So, what do you think? About the books?" "I'm still reviewing," I said carefully. He leaned closer, his tone shifting, less casual now, more calculated. "If anyone asks about the old accounts, the early funding, just keep it simple. You know how these auditors are. They complicate everything." I met his eyes. "I know exactly how auditors are." The audit began quietly, the way these things always do. Emails with subject lines like document request and clarification needed. My father's company was required to submit financial records going back 10 years. He complied, but I could hear the tension in his voice during our brief phone calls. "They're asking about everything," he said one evening, frustration bleeding through. "It's excessive." "It's standard," I replied. I wasn't officially assigned to the case, but Delancey copied me on key correspondence, asked for my input on flagged transactions. I kept my answers professional, clinical. The trust fund transactions appeared in the audit report within 2 weeks. The auditors flagged them immediately. Unauthorized withdrawal of beneficiary funds. Potential misappropriation. My father was asked to provide documentation proving he had legal authority to move the money. He couldn't. Because he hadn't. 3 weeks into the audit, he called me at midnight. His voice was different, thinner, almost pleading. "Mara, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Tell them the money was a loan. That I borrowed it with permission. From you." I stared at the ceiling, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the weight of every moment that had led here. "I was 17 when you took that money," I said quietly. "I didn't even know it existed." "But you could say you did. You could say I told you." "Why would I do that?" Silence. Then, his voice hardened. "Because I'm your father. Because you wouldn't exist without me." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From clarity. The next morning, I emailed Delancey every document I'd compiled. The trust agreement. The withdrawal records. The timeline. I included a single note: "These are the records he didn't want you to see." She replied within an hour. "Thank you. This changes everything." The investigation expanded. What had been a routine audit became a formal inquiry into financial misconduct. My father's business partners were interviewed. His accountant was subpoenaed. The local business journal ran a small piece: "Portland investment firm under review for alleged misuse of family funds." I didn't read the comments. I didn't need to. 2 weeks later, my father's lawyer sent me a letter. It accused me of malicious interference and damaging familial relations. It threatened legal action if I continued to spread false narratives. I showed it to Delancey. She smiled grimly. They're panicking. That's good. Doesn't feel good, I admitted. No, she said. But it's necessary. The following Monday, my father's company received an official notice. The State Financial Regulatory Board was launching a full investigation. His assets were frozen pending the outcome. His name, once synonymous with entrepreneurial success in our small community, became synonymous with scandal. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. But I also felt something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. I felt free. The fallout was immediate and brutal. My father's business dissolved within 6 weeks. His partners withdrew, citing reputational risk. His clients followed. The office with his name on the glass door was emptied and re-leased to a yoga studio. I heard about it through my cousin, who called me crying, asking how I could do this to the family. He stole from me, I said simply. He stole from your dead mother, she corrected, as if that made a difference. From both of us, I replied, and ended the call. The relatives stopped speaking to me. I was labeled vindictive, cold, ungrateful. My uncle sent a long email explaining that family forgives, and airing dirty laundry destroys everyone. I didn't respond. I'd learned long ago that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. My father tried to reach me once more, a voicemail left at 2 a.m. His voice was hoarse, breaking at the edges. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said. I was trying to build something. For us. For the family. You have to understand. I saved the voicemail, not out of sentimentality, but as evidence. Understanding wasn't what he wanted. Compliance was. Meanwhile, my career continued. Creston Financial promoted me to senior forensic analyst, citing my commitment to integrity in confidential performance reviews. I moved to a larger apartment in the Pearl District, one with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city lights. At night, I'd stand at those windows, watching the world move below, and feel the weight of my mother's memory settle around me like a blanket. She'd wanted me to have something. Now, finally, I did. 6 months after the investigation concluded, I received a formal letter from the state. The trust fund, after legal fees and restitution processing, had been reinstated in my name. The amount was smaller than the original, but it was mine. Legally, irrevocably mine. I opened a savings account and deposited it, then printed the confirmation and placed it in a folder labeled Legacy. That evening, I drove to the coast, to a small town called Manzanita where my mother had always wanted to retire. She used to talk about it when I was young, describing the fog rolling in over the beach, the quiet mornings, the sense of distance from everything that hurt. I walked along the shore as the sun set, the sky turning shades of orange and violet. The wind pulled at my hair, cold and cleansing. I thought about my father's toast, his words echoing across the years. Lucky break. He'd been wrong. Luck had nothing to do with it. This was legacy. My mother's legacy, carefully protected, violently stolen, and finally reclaimed. I stood at the water's edge, watching the waves erase footprints in the sand, and felt the last thread of anger dissolve into something softer. Not forgiveness. Just release. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Delancey. Dinner this week? You deserve to celebrate. I smiled and typed back, I already am. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. I stayed until the stars appeared, small and insistent against the darkening sky, and thought about all the ways we survive the people who try to erase us. Sometimes survival looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like distance. And sometimes, it looks like a paper trail that leads straight to the truth. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. No more late-night calls, no more legal letters. My father had moved to Arizona, staying with his brother, far from the whispers and sidelong glances that had come to define his life in Portland. I heard this through the family grapevine, the same network that had once celebrated him and now avoided his name. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt steady. At work, I continued auditing, continued finding patterns in numbers that others missed. There was comfort in the work, in the clarity of evidence, in the way math didn't lie or manipulate or rewrite history. It simply was. One afternoon, Delancey stopped by my office, leaning against the doorframe with a folder in her hand. "Got a new case for you," she said. "Non-profit in Beaverton. Something's off with their donation records." I nodded, reaching for the folder. She didn't hand it over immediately. Instead, she studied me, her expression thoughtful. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said. "No, really. After everything with your father. That kind of thing leaves marks." I set down my pen and met her eyes. "It did. But not the kind you're thinking." She smiled faintly. "Good. Because you're one of the best analysts I've ever worked with. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." After she left, I sat for a moment, staring at the city through my window. The truth was, I didn't doubt it anymore. For years, I'd carried my father's words like stones in my pockets. Too ambitious. Too proud. Too much. Now, I understood. I wasn't too much. I'd just been enough to scare him. That winter, I bought a small house near Powell Butte, a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and front porches where people actually sat. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. Every room, every decision, every paint color chosen without anyone's approval but my own. I hung my mother's photograph in the living room, centered above a small fireplace. Some nights, I'd sit in front of it with a glass of wine, talking to her the way I used to when I was young. I told her about the trust fund, about the audit, about the way her memory had guided me through every decision. I liked to think she heard me. On a Saturday in February, I received an unexpected package. No return address, just my name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a letter, folded once, and a small silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny house. The letter was from my aunt, my mother's sister, who I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. "Maura," it began. "I heard what happened with your father. I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner. Your mother would be proud of you. She always said you were stronger than anyone gave you credit for." This bracelet was hers. She wore it every day. "I think she'd want you to have it now." I held the bracelet up to the light, watching it catch and shimmer. Then I clasped it around my wrist, feeling the cool metal settle against my skin. It felt like an inheritance. Not money, but something better. A reminder that strength could be passed down, that love could survive even absence. Spring arrived slowly, cautiously, the way it does in the Pacific Northwest. Cherry blossoms exploded across the city in clouds of pink and white. I started running in the mornings, tracing routes through neighborhoods I'd never explored, letting my thoughts unravel with each step. One evening, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Apology." I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short message from my father. "Maura, I know you won't forgive me. I don't expect you to. But I need you to know I'm sorry. Not for getting caught. For taking something that wasn't mine. For pretending your success was anything other than yours. I hope one day you'll understand I was trying to build something. I just chose the wrong foundation. Your father." I read it 3 times, then closed the laptop. Understanding wasn't what I needed from him. I didn't need his apology to move forward. I'd already moved. But I saved the email, tucked it into a folder alongside all the other evidence, all the other pieces of a story I'd lived but no longer belonged to. That night, I stood on my back porch, watching the sky fade from blue to indigo. The air smelled like jasmine and fresh-cut grass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car door slammed. Life continued, ordinary and precious. I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who believed she wasn't enough. I thought about my mother, who tried to protect me even from beyond. And I thought about the woman I'd become, not despite the betrayal, but because I'd chosen to face it. The numbers had told the truth. Now so could I. A year after the investigation closed, I was invited to speak at a financial ethics conference in Seattle. The topic was forensic auditing and family businesses, a subject I knew more about than I'd ever wanted to. I almost declined. Public speaking wasn't something I enjoyed, and revisiting the case, even academically, felt like reopening a wound. But Delancey convinced me. "Your story matters," she said. "Not just the outcome. The process. How you handled it." So I went. The conference was held in a sleek downtown hotel, all glass and polished steel. I stood backstage, watching other speakers present, their voices confident and rehearsed. When my name was called, I walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at a sea of unfamiliar faces. "My name is Mara Delgado," I began. "And I'm going to tell you about the hardest audit I ever conducted. The one involving my own father." The room went silent. I spoke for 30 minutes, outlining the case without emotion, focusing on process, documentation, the importance of separating personal feelings from professional responsibility. I didn't mention the toast, the years of dismissal, the way his words had shaped my self-worth. I didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. When I finished, the applause was polite but warm. Afterward, several people approached me, thanking me for my honesty, sharing their own stories of family betrayal and financial misconduct. One woman, older, with kind eyes, squeezed my hand. "You gave him a chance to be honest," she said. "He chose not to take it. That's on him, not you." I nodded, throat tight, and thanked her. That night, I sat in my hotel room, staring out at the Seattle skyline. The city glittered below, alive and indifferent. I thought about my father's email, his apology, the word sorry sitting there like an artifact I could examine but not inhabit. The truth was, I didn't need his sorry. I needed my own peace. And I'd found it. Not in revenge, not in his downfall, but in the simple act of reclaiming what had always been mine. My mother's trust. My own integrity. The belief that I was enough, not because someone told me, but because I'd proven it to myself. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to my aunt, thanking her for the bracelet, for the letter, for remembering. As I typed, I realized I was smiling. Not out of happiness, exactly. Out of relief. The story I'd been living, the one written by my father's expectations and dismissals, had finally ended. The story I was writing now was mine alone. And it didn't need his approval to be true. 2 years after everything unraveled, I received a phone call from an attorney representing my father's estate. He'd passed away quietly in Scottsdale, a heart attack in his sleep. The attorney explained that I was listed as next of kin, that there were some personal effects to be claimed, a few final documents to sign. I thanked him and hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief or regret. I felt something closer to closure, the kind that comes not from resolution but from distance. I drove to Arizona the following week, not for a funeral, there wasn't one, but to collect what remained. His apartment was small, sparsely furnished, the walls bare except for a single photograph of my mother. I stood in front of it for a long time, studying her face, wondering what she'd think of how everything had turned out. In a desk drawer, I found a letter addressed to me, sealed but never sent. Inside, his handwriting, shaky now, filled 3 pages. He wrote about regret, about the choices he'd made, about how pride had consumed him. He wrote about my mother, about how much he'd loved her, how much he'd failed her. At the end he wrote, "You deserved better. From me. From all of it. I hope you've built something beautiful." I folded the letter and placed it in my bag. Then I left, closing the door behind me, walking into the desert heat that felt both suffocating and freeing. On the drive back to Portland, I stopped at a rest area and called my aunt. "He's gone," I said simply. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you feel?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "That's okay," she said. "You don't have to." Months passed. Seasons changed. I continued working, continued building a life that felt solid and true. I started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped young women pursue careers in finance, offering mentorship and scholarship support. It felt right, like passing forward what my mother had tried to give me. One evening, after a mentorship session, a young woman named Soledad approached me. She was 19, sharp-eyed, determined. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "How did you know you were strong enough to do what you did?" I thought about it, about all the nights I'd doubted myself, all the moments I'd wanted to walk away. "I didn't," I said honestly. "I just knew staying silent was worse than the fear." She nodded, absorbing this. Then she smiled. "Thank you." Watching her walk away, I felt something shift inside me. The weight I'd carried for so long, the anger, the hurt, the need to prove myself, it didn't vanish. But it lightened. I'd spent years believing my worth was something I had to earn, something I had to fight for. Now, I understood. It had always been there. I just needed to stop letting other people define it. On the anniversary of my mother's death, I returned to Manzanita. The beach was empty, the sky overcast and brooding. I walked to the water's edge, the same spot I'd stood years before, and pulled out the letter my father had written. I read it one last time, letting the words settle, then folded it carefully and placed it in my pocket. I wouldn't keep it. But I needed to read it, to acknowledge that even flawed people could recognize their failures, even if too late. I thought about legacy, about what we leave behind. My father had wanted to be remembered as successful, powerful, self-made. Instead, he'd be remembered, if at all, as a cautionary tale. My mother had left me something quieter, but infinitely more valuable. She'd left me proof that love could survive, that protection could transcend death, that a single act of care could change everything. I knelt and dug a small hole in the sand, then buried the letter. The tide would take it eventually, dissolve it, return it to the ocean. As I stood, I felt the bracelet on my wrist, the tiny house charm catching the dim light. Home wasn't a place. It was a feeling. Safety. Autonomy. The knowledge that you belonged to yourself. I'd found it. Not in my father's approval, not in his downfall, but in the quiet work of rebuilding. The waves rolled in, steady and endless, and I stayed until the light faded completely, until the stars emerged cold and bright above the dark water. Then I turned and walked back toward the car, toward the city, toward the life I'd built from nothing but determination and my mother's love. Years later, when people asked about my career, about how I'd become one of the leading forensic auditors in the region, I'd tell them the truth. I'd learned from watching numbers lie. I'd learned from uncovering secrets. I'd learned from a case that taught me integrity wasn't optional, it was survival. I didn't mention my father unless pressed. And when I did, I kept it simple. He taught me what not to become. That was enough. Because the story wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about a girl who'd been told she wasn't enough, who'd believed it for too long, and who'd finally learned that worth wasn't inherited or granted. It was built. Line by line. Choice by choice. One honest moment at a time. I kept my mother's photograph on my mantle, kept the bracelet on my wrist, kept the memory of her voice whispering late at night, promising me something no one could touch. She'd been right. What she'd left me wasn't just money. It was permission. Permission to fight. Permission to choose myself. Permission to walk away from anyone who made me smaller. And in the end, that permission, that quiet persistent belief that I deserved better, was the only inheritance I'd ever needed. The morning light filtered through my office windows, casting long shadows across the documents spread before me. Another case, another trail of numbers leading somewhere hidden. I'd become known for this work, for finding what others missed, for asking the questions no one wanted answered. My phone buzzed. A text from Soledad, the young woman I'd mentored. She'd just been accepted into a graduate program in forensic accounting, full scholarship. I did it, her message read. Thank you for showing me it was possible. I smiled and typed back, you did this. I just believed in you. But that wasn't entirely true. I'd done more than believe. I'd shown her that fighting for yourself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. That boundaries weren't cruel, they were survival. That sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you need protecting from. These were lessons I'd learned the hard way, carved into me through years of silence and eventual defiance. And now, I could pass them forward, transformed from pain into purpose. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythm. Cars honked. People rushed past. Life continued, indifferent to individual stories of betrayal and redemption. But those stories mattered. Mine had mattered. Not because it was unique, but because it was true. I gathered the documents, organized them into neat files, and prepared for the day ahead. The work was never finished. There would always be another secret, another lie dressed as legitimacy. And I would keep finding them. Not out of anger. Out of principle. Because someone had to stand for the truth, even when, especially when, it was uncomfortable. That evening, I drove to my aunt's house for dinner, a monthly tradition we'd started after my father's death. She lived in a small cottage in Selwood, surrounded by roses and lavender, the kind of place that felt like an exhale. We cooked together, moving around the kitchen in comfortable rhythm. She told stories about my mother, about their childhood, about moments I'd never known. She used to practice her English by reading the newspaper out loud, my aunt said, laughing. Every morning. She was so determined to sound American, to fit in. Did she? I asked. Fit in? My aunt paused, considering. No. She never quite did. But she stopped trying. She decided being herself was enough. I thought about that as we ate, as the conversation drifted to other things. My mother had given me more than money. She'd given me an example. Not of perfection, but of persistence. Of quiet strength. Of knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. After dinner, my aunt handed me a small box. I found this while cleaning. I think Elena would want you to have it. Inside was a journal, worn and soft with age. My mother's handwriting filled the pages, a mix of Spanish and English, thoughts and prayers and plans. I opened to a random page and read, Mara is stronger than she knows. Smarter than anyone gives her credit for. I worry about what happens if I'm not here to tell her. So I'm writing it down. You are enough, Mija. You always have been. My eyes blurred. I closed the journal carefully and looked at my aunt. Thank you, I whispered. She squeezed my hand. She knew. Even then. She knew you'd be okay. I spent the following weeks reading my mother's journal, absorbing her words, her fears, her hopes. She'd known my father was flawed, had written about it in careful, measured language. He wants so badly to be important. I think he forgets that importance isn't the same as love. She'd worried about me, about whether I'd inherit his need for validation or her quiet certainty. I hope she learns she doesn't need anyone's permission to exist fully. Reading her words felt like a conversation we'd never had, a chance to know her not just as my mother, but as a person. Flawed, thoughtful, deeply loving. She'd set aside that trust fund knowing she might not be there to see me use it. She tried to build a safety net for a future she wouldn't be part of. That kind of love, the kind that plans beyond its own existence, was the most powerful inheritance of all. I placed the journal on my shelf beside the trust fund documents, the two bookends of my mother's legacy. One written in hope. One reclaimed through determination. Together, they told a complete story. Not of victimhood or revenge, but of survival and transformation. I didn't need to forgive my father. I didn't need to forget what he'd done. I just needed to keep moving forward, carrying my mother's love like light. On a cool October evening, I stood in front of a room full of college students, invited to speak about careers in financial analysis. I talked about the work, the skills required, the satisfaction of solving complex problems. At the end, during questions, a young man raised his hand. How do you handle it when the numbers reveal something you don't want to see? I considered the question carefully. You remember that the truth isn't cruel, I said. People are. Numbers just tell us what happened. What we do with that information, that's where ethics come in. He nodded, thoughtful. After the talk, several students approached with more questions, with thanks, with stories of their own family complications. I listened, offered what guidance I could, and felt grateful for the chance to turn my pain into something useful. Driving home, I thought about the girl I'd been at their age. Uncertain. Eager to please. Convinced that being strong meant never needing help. I wished I could tell her that strength was more complicated than that. That asking for help wasn't weakness. That walking away from toxicity wasn't cruelty. That choosing yourself wasn't selfish. But maybe I was telling her. Every time I shared my story, every time I helped someone else find their footing, I was reaching back through time and offering the guidance I desperately needed. The city lights spread before me, infinite and shimmering. I turned on the radio, let music fill the car, and drove toward home. Toward the life I'd built. Toward the future that was finally, completely mine. The folder sat on my desk, manila and unremarkable, labeled simply, Trust, Reinstated. Inside were the final documents, the legal confirmation that what my mother had intended was now, after so many years, exactly as she'd planned it. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal, feeling the texture, the permanence. Then I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to the scholarship fund I'd established in my mother's name. The trust money, what remained after restitution and fees, had become seed money for young women pursuing careers in finance. Each year, We awarded 3 scholarships. Each recipient received not just financial support, but mentorship, connection, a reminder that they weren't alone. This was legacy. Not a name on a building or a company that would eventually fail, but something that would ripple outward, touching lives I'd never meet, creating opportunities that would compound over time. My father had wanted to be remembered. He'd built his entire life around that need. But memory wasn't the same as legacy. One was about ego. The other was about impact. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle and persistent. I stood and walked to the window, watching water streak the glass. My phone buzzed. A message from Delancey: "Drinks next week? New case I want to run by you." I smiled and replied, "Absolutely." The work continued. The city breathed. The rain washed everything clean. And I stood in my office, surrounded by proof of what I'd survived and what I'd built, feeling something I'd once thought impossible. I felt proud. Not of what I'd overcome, though that mattered, but of who I'd become. Someone my mother would recognize. Someone I could finally fully recognize as enough. The folder glowed softly in the desk lamp's light. I closed it carefully, placed it in the drawer with all the other evidence of transformation, and turned toward the door. There was work to do. There were stories to hear. There were numbers waiting to confess their secrets. And I was ready. Not because someone told me I was lucky, but because I'd learned slowly and painfully that luck had nothing to do with it. What my father called luck, the records called something else. They called it legacy. They called it love. They called it the truth, written in ink, impossible to erase. And that truth had set me free. Thank you for watching this story. If moments like these resonate with you, if you've ever had to choose yourself over people who couldn't see you, then you're not alone. We share stories like this every single day, real accounts of people who found their voice, set their boundaries, and walked into the life they deserved. Subscribe so you never miss the next upload, and share your own story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Compliments of the season. I love you all.